Hello everyone, and today we're going to go over Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 3. The Chapter 3 title is called The Jews and Society. Now, in the previous chapter, we discussed how political anti-Semitism rose between the 17th century up until the beginning of the 20th century. And in Chapter 3, Arendt goes into more of the social discrimination that occurred during the same time period. If you haven't already watched Chapter 2, I would recommend doing that first. In this chapter, Arendt again doesn't go over the political anti-Semitism, but the social discrimination that resulted from the new coming equality of society. The Emancipation Edicts of the 19th century wanted equality for condition for all classes, including Jews. This newfound political equality, however, resulted in a social discrimination. Quote, "The more equal conditions are, the less explanation there is for the differences that actually exist between people." What Arendt is saying here is that we're not equal, and that's okay. It's okay to be different. But when equality demands that we see each other as equals, we can't reconcile the differences that we see between us, and thus there is a growing tension between equality and difference. Just as a modern day example, I'm not sure if Arendt would condone this, but say you're going out to a restaurant and your friend says that they're on a diet, so they're not going to eat half the things on the menu. You are equal with your friend, but the minute that they say that they are a certain type of person that does a certain type of thing, there is a difference that is conspicuous in that moment. In this sense, the notion of what makes people equal is not something that is ordained by God that a religion might give you, or it's not based on a human condition that we're all going to die one day, so we're all equal in that sense. The notion of equality that Arendt is attacking is kind of this innate disposition that society expects you to have. It's based on if you're normal, then you're equal. If you're abnormal, then you're treated as an unequal. Again, this quality was an innate thing. And for Jews, that meant that the more equal that the Jewish condition was, the more surprising the Jewish differences were. This conscious difference led to two things. First, there was a social resentment towards the Jews. At the same time, there was some kind of peculiar attraction that the non-Jewish society had towards the Jews. According to Arendt, it's these two interactions that led to and determined the social history of Western Jewry. But let's first make one note here. It's only Jews that decided to interact with society. Before, again, in Chapter 2, we talked about the Jewish bankers, and they had very small connections to society. According to Arendt, these Jews that had the most connection to society and wanted to be socially accepted were Jewish intellectuals. According to Arendt, these Jewish intellectuals needed to be exceptions. They had this background which they were acting against, which it was what people thought to be as Jews, and in order to stand out from the crowd and be socially accepted, they needed to be something called an exception Jew. Quote, "Jews who heard the strange compliment that they were exceptions knew quite well that it was this very ambiguity which opened the doors of society to them." So they needed to be a Jew, but they needed to also not be a Jew. To be accepted by the non-Jewish society, these exception Jews needed to be two things. First, they need to educate themselves to not be like a Jew. Second, they also need to produce something out of the ordinary, something that would make them something valuable that the rest of society could accept them for. This something out of the ordinary originated in an 18th century concept where mankind wanted to see how different and embellish how different he was. And so that means the more different, the more glamorous. And thus the Jews were put up as an example as quote-unquote new specimens of society. Quote, "Eager to stress the basic unity of mankind, they wanted to show the origins of the Jewish people as more alien, hence more exotic, than they actually were, so the demonstration of humanity as a universal principle might be more effective." Since the Jews were seen as a foreign and alien thing, they were also seen as not being polluted by the local culture of the nation, and thus they were seen to be even more human than the local society. The society expected something even more from the Jews, to be remarkable in a human way somehow. These egregious expectations put a lot of pressure on the Jews. First, they were expected to be exceptions of their own race or own families, and second, they were expected to be exceptions of humanity itself. But at this time, this was the ticket of admission into society. However, in Germany in 1807, everything changed with the Edict of 1807 that gave free rights and free equality to all people, including Jews. So basically, if you wanted that job that you were basically rejected before due to your class, you could now get that job. And anybody could basically define themselves through their own individuality. But since this also applied to the Jews, this also destroyed the background off of which they distinguished themselves. These exception Jews were accepted because they were different from this class that was seen to be very different. But now that this class that was different is now the same and is given equal rights, the exception Jews were no longer able to distinguish themselves from their race, and therefore they lost the value that society granted them. To be socially accepted as a Jew, it was no longer sufficient to distinguish yourself from the unknown mass of backward brethren, but instead you had to distinguish yourself now from, quote-unquote, the Jew, a new social embodiment of race. What did this Jew mean? Well, according to the 1802 satire, it depicted Jews as a principle of the Philistine, an upstart society. Jews were no longer seen as an unknown and curious people, but they were seen as wicked. Now, I want to reiterate, this didn't happen to all Jews. Again, the Jewish bankers were separated from society and worked directly with the state, so they didn't receive the social discrimination. The social discrimination was primarily seen by Jewish intellectuals who wanted to become a part of society, which eventually led to a conflict because the Jewish bankers were supporting the government because they were financing the government, but the intellectual Jews were basically radicals and rebels who were working against the government. So you had both in the same class, the Jewish bankers fighting against the Jewish intellectuals. According to Arendt, this only really existed in Germany at the time. Quote, "It is only natural that this social situation, though it made rebels out of the first educated Jews, would in the long run produce a specific kind of conformism, rather than an effective tradition of rebellion. These educated Jews conformed to society, which discriminated against ordinary Jews, and it was incentive of these educated Jews to distinguish themselves from the, quote, Jew in general. This amounted to a double life, where you were a person on the street, but then you were a Jew at home. In this case, the Jews lived in an ambiguity that alienated themselves from their own lives. Arendt says that you could either be a pariah, which means that you could just be kind of sheltered off in your own community, not integrated with society, or you could be a parvenu, which means that you could conform to what society wants, but you have to leave behind your family. Quote, "To be a Jew meant either to be overprivileged upper class in society, or to an underprivileged mass." So what is this idea of a Jew in general? Well, Arendt says it is a transformation which happened from where the Jew used to be related to Judaism, and now the Jew in general is related to this new concept called Jewishness. To be a Jew, it was no longer meant to be seen as following a certain religion or having certain beliefs. Society perceived the Jew as someone who held Jewish traits, which means that they were determined through some kind of psychological attributes that they had. According to Arendt, the Jew in general, as described by professional Jew haters, showed those qualities which the parvenu must acquire if he wants to arrive: inhumanity, greed, insolence, cringing servility, and determination to push ahead. Strangely, these wicked characteristics were actually seen as a virtue among the parvenu. They basically attracted the bourgeoisie in a positive way. And Arendt believes this is the case because during the 19th century, the bourgeoisie had a very boring life and were looking for basically adventure and risks that they could add to their own lives. Thus, Jewishness, this distorted psychological quality, could be easily perverted into a vice. It's this new dark strangeness of the Jews which would eventually develop into a gross Jewish hatred in the 20th century. According to Arendt, no one embodies this as much as one Jew. His name is Benjamin Disraeli. Disraeli was widely known. He was the Prime Minister of England, and he was amongst many, many popular politicians and social classes. According to Arendt, he had a rampant imagination. He accentuated his Jewishness to the ultimate degree by dressing differently, combing his hair oddly, and by queer manners of expression and verbiage. His conscious strangeness that he reinforced also reinforced the stereotype of the Jew, and he was praised for this. Strangely enough, Disraeli was a Jew. He was born a Jew, but he had very few connections to Jewish society, and he wasn't a practicing Jew. He did not practice, and thus his interpretation of what it meant to be a Jew originated mostly in what the public wanted to see, and using his imagination, he was able to give that to them. In continental Europe, the exceptional Jew was seen as a despised thing, but that hadn't reached England yet, so Disraeli had his chance to be able to be popular using these traits. Quote, "The great difference between Disraeli and other Jews is that Disraeli knew even a little less of Jewish past and present, and therefore dared to speak out openly what others betrayed in the half-conscious twilight of behavior patterns dictated by fear and arrogance." Disraeli wasn't afraid of his imagination. He would do whatever at the cost in order to increase his presence. He was so full of himself that he called himself the chosen man of the chosen race. He went so far to say that the Englishman is only a hybrid race, whereas the Jew is a pure race. In this way, Judaism degenerated into basically the simple fact of birth and blood. This resulted in a process of secularization. Secularization led to the reinterpretation of Jewish beliefs. Things like the old messianic hope, where the chosen people would arrive back in Jerusalem, was changed, at least by Disraeli, such that England became his own Israel. Disraeli also perverted the idea of Jewish influence. He expounded the idea that power in the English government was not run by politics, but it was run by secret societies. Inspired by the House of Rothschild's influence, Disraeli believed that everything was being run by back societies, that the Jews were actually controlling everything in the background. Disraeli believed this because he thought that this was revenge of the Jews against Christendom. All these conspiracy theories that he put forward would eventually backfire in the 20th century, and we'll get into that later. In the final section of this chapter, Arendt gives the notion of a vice versus a virtue. She believes the best witness of this idea is a writer, Marcel Proust. Proust believed that the vice of Jewishness was on equal grounds of the vice of homosexuality at the time. Now, a vice is different than a crime. A crime means the actor did a deed that is against the essence of the actor, and thus they must be punished. A vice means the opposite. A wicked deed was done because the person is a certain way, and that can't be changed. For Jews, the vice was treason and traitorous activity, and we'll see this later in the Dreyfus affair. However, because the bourgeoisie was bored and they were looking for adventurous things, they basically accepted these vices of the Jews. According to Arendt, this is the case because of the terrible boredom and weariness of the 19th century. Quote, Proust describes at great length how society, constantly on the lookout for the strange, the exotic, the dangerous, finally identifies the refined with the monstrous and gets ready to admit the monstrosities. Again, these exotic Jews were not the exceptional Jews that we talked about before that were distinguishing themselves from the mass of the rest of the Jewish population. This was something different. This is about a Jew being so unknown to who they're dealing with that it's the mystery that basically claims the interest of the bourgeoisie. Quote, if it is true that Jewishness could not have been perverted into an interesting vice without a prejudice which considered it a crime, it is true that such perversion was made possible by those Jews who considered it an innate virtue. So these Jews, in order to stand out, have to basically use this thing that people thought of as a vice and use it as an innate virtue. They were basically accepting the fact that people thought that they were traitorous beings. Again, anti-Semitism in the 20th century will use this fact in order to condemn the Jews. This vice or crime is what gave the inverts social prestige. In the Dreyfus affair, which we'll go over in the next chapter, Hannah Arendt basically describes a case where this vice was used against a Jew who was actually innocent. And when they found that he was innocent, people started to understand that Jews actually weren't such innate traitors as they thought. Thus, they were kind of left out in the void again. Quote, "As far as the Jews were concerned, the transformation of the crime of Judaism into a fashionable vice of Jewishness was dangerous in the extreme. Jews had been able to escape from Judaism into conversion. From Jewishness, there was no escape. A crime, moreover, is met with punishment. A vice can only be exterminated." Thanks for listening. I hope you learned something. Next time we're going to go over chapter 4, which goes over the Dreyfus Affair, and this is the last chapter of the section on anti-Semitism. The next section is called Imperialism, and that has a few chapters as well. If you have any feedback, please put them in the comments. Thank you.